Welcome back to the Public Rail Now podcast. I'm your host, Adam Barrington. On this episode, I'm joined by doctoral researcher Charles Stevenson. We discuss degrowth, artificial scarcity, neoliberalism, nationalizing major industries, and much more. To learn more about the work Charles and other researchers do at the Real Project, please visit realpostgrowth.eu. And be on the lookout for Charles's articles coming out in Rupture magazine, which you can find at rupture.ie. I also want to remind everyone that on September 20th, there's a nationwide day of action. We're holding rallies for Amtrak and public transportation across the country. You can find out more about the day of action and more at our website, publicrailnow.org.
My name is Charles Stevenson. I'm a PhD candidate at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, working on the Post-Growth Deals project. And basically what that means is that I work on policy packages that would ensure that everyone can lead life with dignity. And then part of my work is more macroeconomic. And in that sphere, I think about what it would mean to have a stable economy that doesn't rely on economic growth.
Thank you so much, Charles, for being here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. So I guess to start us off, reading about degrowth and some of the approaches to economics and political economy coming out of the sort of studies of degrowth and that movement, I think to start us off, it would be good to just kind of like talk about commodification, because that's kind of like a starting point, I think, in a lot of this. So if you just want to tell us, like, what is commodification, and what does the commodification of essential goods like transportation, nutrition, food, housing, healthcare, what does that look like, and how does that impact the satisfaction of human needs?
Sure. So commodification is the act of turning essential goods and services like food and healthcare, as you were saying, into commodities, something that's produced for exchange on a market. This is a particular way of organizing an economy, we should say. It's not inevitable. If we go back to Karl Marx and his famous critique of capitalism, he starts it with the commodity, and that's no accident. Commodities are the basic unit of an economy that's designed around profit making, but commodifying essentials results in all sorts of perverse incentives. Just to give one example, in the US, there's a for-profit healthcare system. Not just insurance companies that are run as businesses, but hospitals that are run as businesses. That means that the incentives in the system lie in prescribing profitable treatments, not in preventative medicine that keeps people as healthy as possible and out of hospitals. There are other countries like Spain, where I live, that don't commodify healthcare, and not only do they spend less, they enjoy better health outcomes.
I think healthcare is a great example, because it's almost like, of course, there wouldn't be anything like an approach to like preventative medicine or preventative care, because it's all they make money when people are sick. So it's like the incentive is sort of like you said, it's made perverse when the healthcare system that's supposed to be helping people get well and live healthy lives makes money off of people being sick.
Exactly.
And that kind of goes hand in hand with commodification goes hand in hand, I think, with privatization, because it's like you don't want anything, if you're someone who is all about privatization, if that's your thing, like you don't want anything left out of the market. So anything that is currently not a commodity, you want it to be a commodity. So it goes through that whole process of commodification, and so it sort of tears apart anything that's like what we think of like a social welfare state. And so can you kind of talk about the process of privatization and how that kind of plays into commodification?
Yeah, absolutely. In the neoliberal period that I think we're going to get to, we saw many key sectors privatized, such as railways in the UK, and you'd be able to talk about this much more eloquently than I can. But it doesn't make a lot of sense to run rail as a for-profit enterprise, given that this is a sector that's a very natural monopoly. And so privatization is essentially the first step towards commodifying any essential good or service.
A part of this is also artificial scarcity. So with commodification and trying to squeeze as much profit out as possible of every section of human life, there's actually a problem of overproduction. There's more things made, more things produced than we actually need. And so can you talk a bit about artificial scarcity and what the function of artificial scarcity is in an economy that has pretty much privatized everything.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, overproduction, to your point, in our economies is key to understanding the need for artificial scarcity, which is what corporations do when they take something that's naturally abundant and limit people's access to it. Take water. There's enough fresh water in the world for us to access, and it's our right as human beings. But corporations enclose water supplies and sell it back to us in plastic bottles, right? Um, so right now in Gaza, there's a risk of polio outbreak, a disease that should have disappeared from the face of the earth because people can't access clean water. And it's not just Gaza. Here in Catalonia, where I live, some people are forced to pay 67 euros per month on bottled water in a place where the median salary is less than 2,000 euros. And the same is true of food, which is a good example of overproduction, actually. It's a sector in which multinationals like Nestle make billions of dollars producing foods that aren't good for us. And the only way that's profitable is through artificial scarcity.
Right. Another aspect of artificial scarcity that I think is worth talking about is its relationship to imperialism. You know, like if you have an overabundance of products, you have to open up new markets to, push those products out into. So I like is can you talk a little bit about that perhaps? What that relationship looks like why there is a need to open up new markets in places where there didn't exist one before in order to kind of like push these products out.
Yeah, I love that you brought that you brought that up. I mean, this was a key problem for imperial powers in South Asia or Latin America, because they needed a way to force people first to work on work for the colonial companies that were arriving, but also to buy the products that those companies were producing, and and to do that, you needed to essentially limit people's access to the provisioning systems that they were already using, because um, in colonized regions, people actually were getting along just fine, and had local economies that weren't designed around profit. And it was through this process of enclosure and the creation of artificial scarcity that imperial powers developed these export oriented, import dependent economies that we currently see across the global south.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been reading about Haiti recently, and when you read about pre-colonial, nations like Haiti, like before it was Haiti proper, um, but all of the resources that are there, things like coca, tobacco, sugarcane, like it should be paradise on earth. Like that's like the tragic thing is like places like that, like that have all these resources that haven't been exploited by an invading power yet. They have everything there to have a fully functional, like just an abundance of resources there, and they're sunk into poverty because these the imperialist nations like move in there and seize control of these resources. And it's why I like what Michael Parenti says. It's not they're overexploited, they're not underdeveloped.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that kind of like gets us into the meat and potatoes here of neoliberalism. So, and that's I actually wanted to ask you first: do you agree with that sort of term, neoliberalism? I know to me, it's like just call it capitalism, but I guess it does describe a particular stage of capitalist development.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I mean, there are about as many different definitions of neoliberalism as there are scholars studying it. If we take David Harvey, famous example, he associates neoliberalism with market logics creeping into every facet of society, as we were discussing with regard to healthcare, or key sectors like the railways in Great Britain, again privatized during the neoliberal period. I had a professor at the University of Oregon, Barbara Muraka, who argues that neoliberalism wasn't just about market expansion. It's a political project designed to revitalize capital accumulation after the crises of the 1970s. And because we've been talking about imperialism, we often forget that these crises were the result of successful decolonization efforts across the global south, and that in these countries, the advent of neoliberalism took the form of structural adjustment programs imposed by the United States via the International Monetary Fund, And these measures resulted in on austerity on a scale we've never experienced in the North. In this vein, the economic historian Quinn Slobodian describes neoliberalism less as a project oriented towards deregulated markets and more focused on insulating capital from democratic oversight. To your point about this being another stage of capitalism, which actually is more typical of capitalism than the New Deal period that is often described as like the golden age of capitalism and ignores the suffering that resulted from it across the global South. But regardless of where you place your focus, everyone agrees that neoliberal political economy is about ensuring high profit rates for a capitalist class that had faced serious challenges to its power through the first 3 quarters of the 20th century.
And I'm glad you brought up the New Deal, and because one thing I wanted to kind of touch on as well is I wanted to see like what your thoughts are on typically the right wing is all about again like privatization, putting everything on the marketplace, like leaving no aspect of social welfare untouched. And it seems now though that there's almost like sections of the right wing at least are admitting that the market left to its own devices cannot really maintain itself, that there has to be some kind of intervention. So I know there's like Milei in Argentina, of course there
Mhm.
are some they still are religious zealots as far as like they want to privatize everything. Elon Musk is similar. He said I think like earlier this year we should privatize everything that can be privatized. But in the United States at least we have like sections of the right, like the Trumpites, that they are starting to get more protectionist and they more nationalistic than sort of a full embrace of a globalized neoliberal economy. And if you could touch on that a little bit, like I'm not sure necessarily what it might look like elsewhere, but is that a pattern that you're seeing in terms of right wing politics?
Sure. I mean, the far right doesn't really have a forward looking vision, does it? It's all about nostalgia for some poorly defined era of capitalism which may never have existed or existed for a white minority sometime after World War II. We see this, for example, with Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany, not to mention the kind of far right projects in the American hemisphere, as you described. But the protectionist policies that Donald Trump and others have been pursuing kind of ignore the global structure of the economy as it exists and ignore the fact that the US really exists as an empire that is sucking value from every other country in the globe. And you're not going to return American industry through these tariffs. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous even to entertain that possibility. And really, what you're looking for is more hardship for ordinary Americans.
Definitely. And I mean we see all the time, there we'll see Trump or like his ilk talk about, oh, we're going to bring jobs back and we're going to get manufacturing back and everything, but it just continues to decline. I can't remember what the latest number was, but you're
Mhm.
absolutely right. I mean it's all just like a dog and pony show that is really going to the weight of it's just going to crush the working class in the United States even more than we're already crushed.
Mhm.
And how they try to, like right now, I mean I live in Cleveland, Ohio, so there's all this talk about getting rid of property taxes, for example. And what that essentially means is they're just going to raise regressive taxes like the sales tax.
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
and who pays for that? Like if Jeff Bezos goes and buys a carton of eggs and I go buy a carton of eggs, we pay the same sales tax.
Yeah.
So it's but yeah, I just think it is interesting. I liked what you said about the far right not having a forward vision. It's I mean, what would you call it? It's almost like it is this sort of weird yearning for a fictional past, but it also seems to have something of like a death drive. Like we're just
Yeah.
accelerating the destruction of organized human life even quicker than we would otherwise.
Have you been reading Richard Seymour? I really liked his recent book, Disaster Nationalism, for anyone who wants to dig into the desires of the far right.
I have not, but yeah, talk about that. That'd be great.
No, I mean, he uses this phrase "inchoate fascism" to describe what we're seeing, and that it's not quite a return to the classical fascism, like Italian, German, whatever, of the 1930s. But you have certain echoes of it, and as you point out, he thinks a lot about this death drive, and points to the fact that the far right um, aren't interested in actually kind of saving civilization, or building something new. He uses the example of the wildfires in Oregon, which were blamed by local far right militias, not on actual climate breakdown, but on Antifa. And the phrase he uses is that, you can't shoot the climate crisis, but you can shoot Antifa, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's. I mean, we see that it's funny to bring that up because I mean there was just yesterday a far right commentator got killed at a rally in Utah, and we already see the right just blaming it on the left. We don't even know who did it, but they can they would they don't have an answer for the actual increase in violence and the sort of like degradation of life in the United States, and it's in how that causes violence and even political violence. It's, oh, the left did it, the radical left did it, like they
Mhm.
like they rather than actually like try to solve any kind of political or social ills, they just point the finger at a boogeyman. Like,
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
yeah, so kind of yeah, reeling us back in here, but the commodification of essentials of life and this creation of artificial scarcity, they are major parts of neoliberalism, at least the neoliberal stage of capitalism. Um, where do you see that going? Like it's kind of piggybacking off of what we were kind of talking about in terms of this maybe an admission from some sections of the right that having like the market, this invisible hand idea, control everything. It just isn't working out. I think we saw that especially during the COVID-19 pandemic when it was at its height. It was just this. It was an admission that the market cannot maintain organized human life. So I'm wondering, do you see a sort of precipice that we're going towards, or like where do you see this going? If we don't try an alternative.
Mhm. Well, it seems to me that we're certainly in some kind of transition away from this neoliberal period in capitalist history as we've come to understand it, towards something new. And the political economy of that new society is still being defined, as you point out. And there are a lot of debates about, are we still in neoliberalism? Is neoliberalism dead? What is the political economy of this new stage that we're entering? And over the summer, I was reading Jodi Dean's new book, Capital's Grave, and she argues that we're in a kind of transition towards a neo feudal economy in which capital is very much still present and very much still a driving force, but the laws of motion of capitalism are changing and evolving. And whereas previously we had competition between capitalist interests and this push towards monopoly, now we have platforms that actually mediate our access to a market. And so, like, Uber would be an example of that. Uber doesn't actually own the means of production, right? Uber doesn't build anything. Uber forces its driver to use their own cars as a means of making a living. And I think that this new period, however you want to call it, you don't have to call it neo feudalism. It still needs to be adequately theorized, but it's clear to me that we are transitioning from we've been calling it neoliberal capitalism towards something new. And what that something new is, whether it's something worse than capitalism or whether it's a more hopeful future, will depend on the struggles that are already underway here and now.
Definitely. And speaking of that, let's talk about degrowth. So, for folks who might not know, what is degrowth, and what kinds of concrete policies and programs would one find in, a government or society that's pursuing a degrowth agenda?
Yeah, let's think about a more hopeful future than
Yeah, exactly.
capitalism, right? Degrowth is an economy that works for everyone within planetary boundaries. So the project that I work on was brought together to figure out how that economy is actually going to function. As I was saying, part of my job is putting together a policy package that can ensure that everyone gets what they need to live life with dignity. that basically amounts to the exact opposite of the processes of commodification and privatization that we've been discussing. It means creating universal public services so that no one goes without food, housing, or healthcare. It means enacting a federal job guarantee so that we can end the scourge of involuntary unemployment. People think these demands are unrealistic, but there are examples of them everywhere we look, really. When I moved to Spain, I didn't have to sign up for health insurance. I just walked down the street to my local clinic and they gave me a health card. And now anytime I need to see a doctor, I make an appointment online and it's and I see a doctor, and it's really that simple. Um, there's a job guarantee, to talk about that for a second, currently in place in India, employing millions of people. Even in the US, we've known periods of full employment, as we did during the Second World War as a result of the New Deal. Not to be totally nostalgic, but to point out that the problem again is not immigrants taking our jobs. It's poor economic policy. The challenge becomes in the context of building universal public services, the challenge becomes getting people to care about something when the incentive isn't getting rich. We live in an economy in which the principal motivators are fear and greed, and that's dismal. We can do so much better. We need to create systems in which we can all work in the knowledge that we are part of confronting the greatest challenges of the 21st century. That's absolutely possible. We don't have to go to work knowing that the alternative is being evicted from our apartment.
Yeah, and I mean, it seems like this kind of thinking is it's it's just it's 100% necessary. I mean, at this point, like they're really, they used to, Margaret Thatcher had the whole "there is no alternative" Tina,
Mhm.
talking about capitalism, but it seems like I mean, right now, like it's pretty obvious. Like if we don't do something different, if we don't pursue something like degrowth, then organized human life is just going to end. I mean, so it's like there is no alternative but something besides what's going on right now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so how I guess like what before I get into talking about like nationalization, um like how does that process start? Like where would you in terms of like decommodification, for example? What are some examples like of decommodification as a process? Like I don't know if you have any specific examples
Mhm.
of maybe like um decommodifying housing, or like previously privatized industries becoming public. What are
Yeah.
some examples of that process?
Yeah, well, that seems to go hand in hand with nationalization, as you were saying. I mean, um, it, as we've been discussing in the last 40 years, key sectors like healthcare, transport, energy were privatized in many countries, and achieving universal public services, which we would see as a core objective under in a degrowth economy, requires bringing those essential services back under public ownership, and that's nationalization. There's an organization called Climate Vanguard in Britain that put out a brilliant report detailing exactly what this would look like for the fossil fuel sector in Great Britain, which doesn't just need to be nationalized, but it needs to be phased out. Um, this is just the most pragmatic approach to the situation we're in. As you were saying, either we change the ways our economies are run, or we're going to face a dire situation by the end of the century. And I'd just like to add that all these policies that we're discussing, decommodifying sectors, nationalizing others, it's all been done before.
Yeah, and as we were kind of talking about earlier, like with how there really is like a global economy. I mean, global capitalism is just like a fact of life, and so I guess like I'm interested in hearing about, if a certain society or government starts pursuing things like nationalization. I mean, we know what happens, like especially when you see things like land reform. Of course, Washington
Mhm.
starts sending in agents to reverse any kinds of reforms like that. But like I guess on a global scale, because it seems like we can't just have degrowth, decommodification in one country. It has to be a sort of global project. Um,
Mhm.
so if you could talk about that a bit, like just like what would it take, or like what does that look like, and is there anything in the air that makes you feel like that could be a reality?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that we can't have degrowth in one country. And the other key point that you alluded to is that in the globalized economy of the 21st century, sovereignty is fragmented. So wherever you come to power, you're going to face limits based on devolution. If this is at municipal level, you're curtailed by the laws of the state and at the federal level. If we imagine a degrowth aligned, we don't have to call any of this degrowth. We can call it whatever we want. We can call it, the fight for life on Earth, whatever. They're going to be limited by the fiscal rules in Brussels, for example. Any government within the eurozone. So there's kind of this parcellated sovereignty, which is a problem, but it doesn't mean that we can't be experimenting at every scale. And I think that what we need to be doing is thinking about the platforms that can get people excited for winning office at any and every scale, and then how to be as strategic as possible to advance some kind of social ecological transition once in power.
Yeah, and I'm interested in hearing, like, are there different models that you've observed, like, or different kinds of even if they're just theoretical, like, is there sort of just one path to degrowth, or are there multiple ways that folks can go about pursuing degrowth?
No, I mean, I definitely don't think there's one path. I also think it's very dependent on where you sit in the global economy. Degrowth is a program for countries of the global north, in which we have kind of overdeveloped economies, and ensuring access to need satisfiers in places like Spain, where I am, would be fairly straightforward, given given existing production. We in the countries we've been talking about, we have overconsumption. So degrowth is the program. In countries of the global south, where you have widespread social deprivation, we need to start thinking not so much about degrowth, but about delinking from the globalized economy, as we've been discussing, and creating space for development, and in many cases growth. Like most sectors in the global south, whether that's healthcare, education, housing, need to grow. And so that's a key. I would say that's a key difference between countries in the north and countries in the south. But this shouldn't also be a prescriptive project. I mean, what we're doing here is trying to create space for a world of many worlds, and whether it's degrowth in the north or delinking in the south, this will look different in every place, but it will require confronting these capitalist and imperial institutions, as we've been discussing.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the global north versus global south, because to me, I was going to ask if my understanding is correct that degrowth, because when I think about oftentimes in the United States, like, you hear mostly from the right political commentators, they criticize any kinds of talk about how we need to be better about how we're handling the climate crisis, and then they'll point the finger and say, oh well, India pollutes X amount, and all these other countries, like, they'll point the finger at global south countries and say that they're actually doing all this polluting, and it's the sort of hypocrisy of the global north nations saying, oh, they need to stop doing that before we stop doing that, and it's hypocritical because it's like, okay, well, you developed, so, like, why, so you're going to take the chance of development away from like global south countries, like, in not taking a step as a country in the global north towards something like degrowth, so I'm just glad you brought that up, and I'm wondering, speaking of different kinds of models, uh, what kinds of differences, if we could go into a little more detail about the differences in political and economic context, and how they might have an influence on those approaches. So, we kind of touched on it a bit, but why would a certain model work somewhere, say in North America versus Europe? Like, what
Mhm.
what yeah, like, sort of like the political and economic context and their influence on what kinds of approaches to degrowth there might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that the overarching goal that I've labeled universal public services, possibly complemented by a job guarantee. We could also think about working time reductions in certain contexts. This is kind of like a grand goal, and it will look, as we're saying, different in different places, but it applies both in countries in the global north and the global south. It's just not up to me to say what universal public services look like in Africa, where I don't know anything about the context, right? Um, I think that to well to go back just for a second, with regard to like key differences between northern and southern countries, like for for there to be a pathway towards towards delinking in the South, we need to see debt restructuring, right? Given the debt crisis that's afflicting countries across the global South, and whether that takes the form of defaults or some other pathway, again, isn't really up to me to say. But I would say that's a big difference between between a country in the South and a country like the United States, which could really embark on a program of economic transformation tomorrow without really having to confront institutions, because it basically controls a lot of these institutions. We used the example of the IMF earlier. I guess something that might look different from between the U.S. and Europe is the sector that you're most familiar with. You know, in Europe we have a fairly integrated train system, right? There's so many ways it could be easily improved. There's no real reason why we don't have a unified pan-European train system, but a lot of the hard infrastructure is there already. So it's about changing incentives. It's about expanding access. It's about getting people out of cars and onto trains. In the U.S., that needs to be built in large part. So there are huge differences in in requirements, even on a basic infrastructure level, depending on where you are in your transition towards some kind of access to universal public services.
I thinking about the rail system in the U.S., which is obviously what public rail now's main focus is. Um, the thing is, like, we have this massive industry, like the railroads, um and now they're going even further into consolidation. So there's this merger happening between Union Pacific and Norfolk Southern.
Mm-hmm.
There's talks of other mergers. Prior to 1980, there were 40 class 1 railroad like corporations, the major rail corporations that own the infrastructure and whatnot. And now there's only 6, and it's going to be 5. And it's such a huge critical industry that it really cannot exist without support from the federal government, aka the public. So it's I kind of wanted to get your thoughts on like this how the public actually subsidizes these massive industries anyway. Like, it's like we're paying for them to be as bad as they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how I guess maybe the differences between something like a degrowth model, versus what we do right now, which is essentially subsidize private industries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean it's public costs and privatized profits, right? And as you pointed out, you have this tendency across sectors towards monopolization, and the only thing to be said about the rise of these kind of these conglomerate companies, of these massive corporations, is that the pathway towards public ownership becomes quite straightforward. So with something like rail, which is a public good, which should be run as a public entity, nationalizing those corporations is actually more straightforward than if you have a more fragmented network, right?
Yeah, I mean that's so it's I've made the joke a couple times, like about the class 1 railroads just going full mask off and just operating like a monopoly. I mean they operate like a cartel already, but
Mhm.
go ahead and become a monopoly. It'll be easier to nationalize then.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in talking about nationalization, decommodification, and elements of degrowth, what are the barriers to that? Like what? Who's in opposition to this? I think we know, but like who's in opposition to something like a degrowth agenda or things like nationalization? Like what kinds of things do we have to overcome to get to that point?
Yeah, I mean the barriers to these programs are the same that they've always been. It's the power of the richest in society. The reality is that building the kind of economy that we're talking about, an economy that's focused on care and inclusive public services, just isn't profitable. So we need to overcome the corporate lobbies buying off politicians who tell you that Americans want the freedom to choose their health insurance provider. I was talking with my roommate last night, and he joked that he moved from the US to Europe and his salary halved, but the quality of his life improved in part because he could actually get healthcare. And the good news for degrowth proposals is that they benefit everyone in society aside from the capitalist class. They create time for what really matters, be that kind of friends, nature, art, connection. So yeah, the barriers are corporations who have the money, and we have people.
Definitely. And it's I think like the question of like political will like comes into play a lot, like I think in this whole thing, because we have to have people that are willing to take a stand for this, and have the people that have mass public platform. The biggest example in the US, for decades, it has was the Bernie Sanders campaign. I mean, talking about Medicare for all and all that, and that really woke up a lot of people, I think, to this idea that there is another way that we could structure our lives. Like, society does not have to be this game of wolves where everybody's knifing each other in the back and everybody's just getting theirs, and to hell with everybody else. It wasn't a perfect platform or program that he put out, but it was something completely almost unheard of for generations in this country. So, um, but I'm thinking about, like, again, like the political will question. You know, how much power do these elected officials actually have, or representatives of the people that could pursue something like degrowth? You know, it seems like because of the power of these massive corporations, the lobbyists, in the U.S. and elsewhere. I mean, these corporations are transnational. They're everywhere now, and like so. It seems like a really big monster to go up against, and I'm wondering, what your thoughts are on sort of how much power these political movement might have, like in actually changing things, like what would need to be behind something like a political figure coming out for degrowth. Yeah, I guess the limitations, or what kinds of what is the actual like ability of somebody who is in a position like a politician. What power do they actually have to change things, I guess, is the short way to ask it.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I would agree. I would agree with your initial point. I think that the primary obstacle that elected officials face is timidity. You could call it cowardice, and then it's coupled with poor political analysis. Um, so again and again, we see attack towards the center, whereas poll after poll show how popular the proposals we've been discussing are. In the U.S., I recommend checking out the work of the Center for Working Class Politics on this question that shows, for example, that a job guarantee is hugely popular across partisan divides, and no one's talking about it. So I'm not saying you need to call yourself the party of degrowth, but you need to tell people who are struggling how you're going to improve their lives. And to stick in the US, Democrats don't do that because they're beholden to corporate interests. So of course they're losing to the inchoate fascists, if we're going to call them that. Where the left comes to power, again, it has to contend with the fragmentation of sovereignty that we've been discussing, and there are real hurdles, whatever the scale at which you come to power. I guess the possible exception is if you win the U.S. presidency and get a majority in Congress, as we're currently witnessing, you can pretty much do whatever you like. Again, because kind of the U.S. is at the top of the global economic hierarchy, and sucking value from the rest of the globe. But it, despite the fact that it amounts to an uphill battle, what's the alternative? I think that there's real poetry in resisting a capitalist class that's stealing our beautiful world from us.
Absolutely. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard. It's I think it was Mark Fisher that had the quote about it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. But it's and I think in somewhere like the US, where the imperial boomerang is really hitting hard. I mean, people are really it's we're having to come to terms with like an empire in decline. Like, we're essentially a a giant military, and that's about it. Um, yeah, it really makes you wonder, like, you know, whether this kind of change is even possible within the current political framework. And so I think it, yeah, I mean, it might be worth like talking about, like, how do we encourage a different kind of political imaginary? Like, how do we encourage this kind of thinking that that another world is possible?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think we're all excited to give a U.S. example about the mayoral campaign of Zoran Mamdani in New York City, and I think he's showing that it is possible to run a very different campaign on a very different platform that might be reminiscent, as you were saying, of Bernie Sanders, but that's probably to his left, and he's essentially running on a transition platform towards universal public services, and New Yorkers are really into it because they're struggling to survive in a cost of living crisis. Not surprisingly, corporate America are throwing everything they have at him. But if you're anywhere close, you should go knock on some doors and listen to what people's lives are like. It's a lot of fun, and you meet wonderful people. I think for me the best thing about being in degrowth friendly spaces is that they attract the most wonderful people. As you point out, electoralism isn't enough. If we're going to make it through the century, we need to find ways of building coalitions between labor unions and associations like Railroad Workers United and social movements like the incredible solidarity we're witnessing with Palestine, and channeling the power of these coalitions through organizations that can fight and win. To to your point about kind of imperial backlash, I think the solidarity we're seeing with Palestine shows that there still exists, and there is a burgeoning and expanding anti-imperialist sentiment, even in the global north, and that to me is exciting. I've mentioned Britain a few times, so if you're there, be sure to join the New Left Party being launched by Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn. And of course, in the global south, these kinds of organizations are often bigger and more vibrant, and while facing heavier repression. But change is possible, and history is written by ordinary people demanding what's rightfully theirs.
Couldn't agree more. And I wanted to ask you, maybe we could go into a little more detail about what kinds of social movements are currently behind movements for degrowth, or in which ones should be, because it's
Mm-hmm.
that's always been I mean, I hate to stick in the United States, but that's where I live, and that's where our campaign is headquartered. So in our, again, our focus is the freight rail system here, but um it in the United States, it's always one of the things that we've been trying to do is connecting, for example, like the environmental justice movement with the labor movement, and trying to really introduce this idea that the interests of the labor movement and folks that are fighting for environmental justice, they are not diametrically opposed. Like, they are not mutually exclusive. They have more overlap than they don't. And I guess, like, one of the barriers is, there are certain jobs that have to do with extraction, and one of the big talking points from the right has been for a long time, like Trump's whole, like, we're bringing coal back, for example. Like, and of course, if you're a coal miner in East Kentucky, um and that's your livelihood, you're not wrong to think, like, well, yeah, well, that is in my interest. Like, I need to have a job to take care of my family and support myself. So um
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like, so how do we, like, yeah, again, like, what movements are behind things like degrowth, what movements should be behind things like degrowth, and sort of what are ways that we can connect these different movements that should be a part of this site of intersecting struggles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that question. I just to stick with your point about coal miners for a second there. I wanted to flag that degrowth is also building on the work of a researcher named Juan Martinez Allier here in Barcelona, and he developed this idea of the environmentalism of the poor, which really shows that while today we have this idea that environmentalism is a luxury that's only afforded to the wealthy. Historically, it's often been, to your point about environmental justice struggles in the U.S. And elsewhere, it's often been championed by by the working class, by the working poor, and so there are natural allyships here, even in communities that historically have been very dependent on extractive industries. I mean, degrowth as it currently exist is quite an academic movement. It's in some ways over intellectualized, um, and I'm unsure whether the struggles that could bring degrowth to fruition need to really champion this, need to fly under the banner of degrowth. All right, I think that uh, that these coalitions that we're talking about, they need to speak to the current moment, and they need to channel the energy that exists. 5 years ago, I cut my teeth in the climate and ecological struggles, and those movements got really decimated by the pandemic, and haven't quite come back in the same way. And we know that these social movements, they come in waves, and there will be a climate movement in the future, but it needs to integrate demands for Palestinian liberation, for example. It needs to learn from it needs to learn from everything that's happened since, because actually these interconnections, these potential allyships is like are the hills on which our movements will live or die. And Richard Seymour, again, who I was quoting earlier, has this nice phrase, which is like having hope is like being in love, and you can't bully someone into it. So I think it's less about forcing people to care about a specific issue, and more about meeting them where they're at.
Absolutely. I again couldn't agree more. And before I let you go, it's been such a pleasure having you on. But I want to make sure that folks know, where can they find more out? Where can they find more about your work, and maybe read some of the things you've put out, and yeah, just if you've got anything you're working on right now, if you anything to plug.
As you were saying that, I was kind of panicking because I don't know the actual URL of our research project, which is embarrassing. But if you Google post growth deals in Barcelona, we should come up. It's a project that's headed by professors Julia Steinberger, Jason Hickel, and Yorgos Kallis. And there's a bunch of exciting research coming there. I should have a couple articles coming out soon in Rupture Mag, which is edited in Ireland, and do really cool eco-socialist work. So yeah, look for that. That should be the October edition. And I just wanted to say it's been great talking to you, Adam. Yeah, huge fan of the work, and solidarity with RWU.